This week, I've been meeting up with people, old friends actually, that I haven't seen for a long time. Each time I've met someone, while I've been standing waiting to meet them, I've been thinking actually the same thing. I've been wondering to myself, what will happen when we see each other for the first time? Will we hug? Will we even shake hands? Or will we bump elbows? Or maybe nothing? And every time there's been that hesitation as the two of us meet, and actually most of the occasions it then quickly becomes a big hug, which has been brilliant. And I know not everyone likes hugs. And for so long, a global pandemic has forced us away from that kind of contact into isolation. Some people initially like that because not everyone likes hugs, and that's okay. But experts have told us again that we haven't just missed hugs because sometimes people like hugs, and we haven't just missed contact, but that we actually need physical contact. It's not just a preference, it's a basic human physical need. In fact, research has shown that children who miss out on human contact, things like hugs and touch and cuddles, measurably flourish less. They develop more slowly. It's built into us as human beings that we need physical human contact, not just for our mental health, but physically for our well-being, our development, our growth. And being prevented from that kind of contact for so many people that we've loved has been so hard for so many. You might have seen some of the touching images out there, either as restrictions eased and for the first time people were allowed to hug each other, or even before that, where relatives who were trying to make the best of a difficult situation went to all sorts of extremes to get some sort of contact with children or grandchildren or relatives. Today we're looking at a story about a man called Jesus of Nazareth. You might have heard of him. I'd like to run a couple of statements past you and see what your reaction is. Jesus of Nazareth never met a prostitute. Jesus of Nazareth never met a leper. Now, what are you thinking? You're maybe thinking, well, actually, I've heard stories about Jesus with prostitutes, and I've heard stories about Jesus with lepers. Well, let's together have a look. In a book that we call Luke, and that's a collection, one of the collections of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, that was probably collected together, these accounts, and crafted together about 30 years or so after Jesus' execution. In his story, he has Jesus, towards the start, wandering around in chapter 5 in the north of a country called Israel, in an area called Galilee. And the writer doesn't give any of the bits of the story titles, but often in our English translations there are titles. And this part of the story, in the middle of chapter 5, often has the title of Jesus and then something about a leper. But that's not what is written down. Instead, our storyteller tells us that Jesus met a man filled with or covered with leprosy. Jesus did not meet a leper. Jesus met a man. A man who was filled with this disease. Jesus didn't meet lepers. Jesus didn't meet prostitutes. That's not what he saw when he encountered them. Our theme question as we are wrestling with Luke has been, who does he think he is? A side question could easily be, who does he think each person he meets is? Who does he think I am? Who did he think this man was? Well, when he met this man, he met him as a man, not as a leper. What we know is that in the ancient world, historians and others will tell us that, in fact, this man may or may not actually have what we might call leprosy. In the ancient Near East, a whole range of conditions, most of them skin conditions, were lumped together and called leprosy. People knew something about it, but not everything about it, and there were so many varieties. But the general assumption was that this was a condition that was incurable, that was infectious or contagious, and that the most effective way to deal with it was quarantine. Difficult for us to imagine, do you think? A disease without a cure, one that generates fear, and one that is dealt with just by isolation, quarantine. Notice that this man doesn't ask Jesus of Nazareth for healing, not in those words. Instead, he uses the word clean. And this is a Greek term, and it's also a term in Jewish culture that was not about being dirty. Instead, this was connected to a set of rules and social ways of being that the Jewish people had been given actually in their scriptures to deal with something they would term ritual purity. And so they're not talking about being dirty. Instead, they're talking about their worship system, their social system, and about how they deal with the parts of the creation project they feel are broken or rebelling against God, and how that can help them then connect somehow with a God who is distinct, who is different, who is holy. And so they have this system, and it involves this idea of ritual impurity and purity. And an awful lot of it, actually, if you look, was actually based on pretty sensible rules that we would now just call hygiene, about keeping certain things separate. But not all of it was as clear as that. And this idea of becoming ritually unclean was one that was connected to some actions, but also to some kind of conditions. And leprosy, skin diseases, was one of them. Now, what this meant in the ancient Near East, and particularly in the Jewish culture, was that if you were affected by this, then you were excluded. Not just excluded from worship, but excluded from everything. From your family, from your friends, from society, from business, from earning a living, everything. This man, this story, is not just someone who's ill and wants to be well. This is about someone who's excluded from everything and is desperate to be restored. Jesus hears this man's cry, and his response, Jesus' response, is immediate. He says, "Be clean," and immediately the leprosy is gone. But something happened before that. Look at the story. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. This story, stories like it, might be listed as stories about miracles. I wonder if the real miracle in these stories is not that Jesus of Nazareth healed a man with leprosy, but that Jesus of Nazareth touched a man with leprosy. The first response of Jesus isn't healing. The first response of Jesus is compassion. I'd argue, and I think I'd be pretty confident in winning this argument, that human touch communicates love. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched the man with this condition. That is deep in what it means to be a human. That's why for the past few months, things have not just been scary and inconvenient, but we've been deeply heartbroken, longing for contact with those whom we love, because it communicates love. Jesus touched this man. As he did that, the people who might be witnessing this, or those who were hearing the story read out as they gathered as groups of new Jesus followers in the first century, might be thinking, but if Jesus touched this man, then Jesus would be infected. Infected by the disease, or infected with this ritual uncleanness. But what seems to happen in this story is the opposite. This is a Jesus story that turns things on its head. Jesus doesn't get infected. In fact, you could argue that Jesus infects the man. Jesus brings to him healing, cleansing, wholeness, restoration, acceptance, freedom from what's been keeping him back. Perhaps Jesus infected him with love and grace. And like so much of the story, that grace and love and restoration and acceptance will be again and again his theme. Jesus then sends the man away to the temple in Jerusalem. In their system, to be fully restored into everything, society, worship, the community, you had to be officially declared clean. And that required a priest at the temple to examine you, to offer the right sacrifices, and then declare that you were restored. This is what Jesus tells the man to go and do. And this is Luke, the writer, double stamping, adding an extra layer, saying, this is real. This is a complete change. Jesus makes a physical and a whole life difference. This is not just about nice words or rumours of kind of things he's done. Here's the evidence. A man's life completely changed. And those in the temple, they can see it too. And then at the end of this little story, our writer includes again a note about the kind of man Jesus of Nazareth is. Completely unique. Because this kind of story could easily have been the story about fame, about wonder, and about following, about drawing huge crowds, which is in fact eventually what happened. But that's not what Jesus is about. That's what the culture around would have decided. They would have said, you have power, you can heal, look at what you can do, imagine how famous and powerful you can be. But instead, Jesus tries to calm the rumours. Jesus tries to avoid the fuss, and instead, drained, it seems, withdraws to a lonely place to pray. This Jesus is a man of prayer, not a man of fame. Of course this news spread, despite what Jesus said. What could stop it? But that's not, our writer is telling us, what this Jesus is interested in. In fact, like any health worker, like any of our NHS workers, many of them in our community here, he had far more important work to be involved in than fame and fortune. And the kind of work, in fact, that we're made for, that we're invited to join in with, is the kind of sacrificial work that is draining and exhausting. And at the same time, it's the most meaningful work in the world. But Jesus needs to withdraw, to restore, to pray. Who does he think he is? Who does he think I am? This kind of story tells me that you and I are invited to spread this kind of message, to become a super spreader, if I'm allowed to say that. This Jesus story is a story of being part of God's project of acceptance, of restoration, of seeing not the condition, but seeing the person. Looking for those who are excluded, outcasts, isolated, quarantined, and bringing them back home and into wholeness and to be the people they were made to be. This is God's project of healing and grace and restoration and compassion and love. And just like the news that spread around Jesus, it cannot be stopped.